You like to believe you know yourself, that you'd never follow a terrible order, that if someone told you to hurt another person just because they wore a lab coat, you'd walk away. You wouldn't hesitate, you'd say no. But in 1961, at Yale University, an ordinary man in a gray jacket told strangers to press a button. With each press, another human screamed in pain. Most people kept pressing, even when the screams turned to silence, even when the subject to just a voice behind a wall begged for mercy. They pressed the button, because the man in the gray jacket said please continue, because there was a clipboard, a white hallway, a promise that this was necessary, and so they obeyed. They didn't look like monsters, they looked like us. That experiment, the Milgram study, was never meant to shock the world, but it did. It revealed something cold and quiet inside us, a capacity not for evil, but for compliance, for going along, for silencing our instincts when authority leans in and whispers it's okay. You hear about things like this and feel a quiet discomfort rising, because part of you still wants to say, I wouldn't do that, and another part isn't so sure. What if the real danger isn't the bad person, but the ordinary one? When placed in the right costume, the right system, the right moment. Tonight we'll walk slowly through experiments that revealed not just what humans are capable of, but what they are when no one is watching. No blame, no judgment, just observation. If this feels like home, like a place where thoughts come to sit quietly beside truth-like, and subscribe. And tell me, what thought keeps you up at night? You imagine a quiet room, fluorescent lights, a clipboard on the table. A man in a lab coat stands behind you, calm, almost bored, as he gestures toward a large switchboard with labels like slight shock and danger severe shock. In the next room, you hear another man unseen, strapped to a chair, electrodes on his skin. Every time he gets an answer wrong, you're told to press the next switch. With each level, the voltage rises. He yells, he begs, he screams that his heart hurts. Then silence. But the man in the lab coat nods. Please continue, he says, and you do. This is the Milgram experiment. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you thought it was exaggerated. But the truth is darker. Over 65% of participants went all the way administering what they believed was a fatal shock simply because someone in authority told them to. No reward, no gun to the head, just obedience. And these weren't villains. They were teachers, salesmen, clerks, people like you. People who walked in thinking they'd never hurt another person. People who smiled nervously as they sat down thinking they were just part of a harmless psychology study. But the moment came, the scream, the silence, the command, and they complied. There's a story you carry about yourself, that you're a good person, guided by conscience, immune to corrupt influence. But Milgram's results whisper something else, that the gap between who you think you are and what you might do under pressure is thinner than you want to admit. You tell yourself, I would have stopped, but would you? Because there's another layer beneath the obedience relief. Relief that someone else is taking responsibility, that you're not deciding alone, that the consequences aren't fully yours. The lab coat becomes a shield. You hide behind procedure, behind the soft logic that they must know what they're doing. This is the ego defense of delegation, handing over the burden of choice to someone who seems more equipped, more certain, more official. You feel small, unsure, and the mind craves a parent figure. The inner child whispers, tell me what to do, and someone does, so you listen. It's not just compliance, it's a longing to be guided, to be innocent again. Psychologist Stanley Milgram didn't set out to prove people were evil. He wanted to understand how atrocities happen, how ordinary citizens in Nazi Germany or any system become agents in machinery that violates their values. His conclusion was chilling. The capacity for cruelty lies not in hatred, but in obedience. You may think this doesn't apply to you, but look again. Have you ever gone along with something because your boss asked? Stayed silent in a group when your gut said speak? Allowed a rule to override your empathy? This isn't about the extreme. It's about the quiet betrayals we participate in, simply because we're told this is the way it works. And it's not just you. The brain is wired for cognitive ease, to follow patterns, to trust authority, to avoid friction. Resistance takes energy. Doubt takes courage. Saying no requires standing alone, and most people, when stripped of social support, find themselves whispering yes, even as their hands shake. There's a paradox here. The more civilized the setting, the cleaner the room, the whiter the coat, the easier it becomes to override your instincts. Violence in chaos repels us, but violence dressed in order seduces. So the experiment isn't historical, it's happening now. In every boardroom where decisions get passed down the chain, in every hospital where protocols override care, in every system where empathy is filtered out through layers of just doing my job. It happens in the way we defer, the way we rationalize, the way we excuse. And yet there's a question lingering at the edge of all this. What does it take to stop pressing the button? Not after the fact, not in hindsight, but in the moment, with someone urging you on, the world watching silently, and your heart pounding against your ribs like a warning. What wakes you up? For some, it's a scream that sounds too human to ignore. For others, it's eye contact, a trembling hand, a whisper of please, something that pulls you out of the trance, that reminds you this is real, this is now. You are choosing, because that's the trap, forgetting that you are choosing, even when obeying, even when following orders, you are still choosing. So maybe the real danger isn't that someone will force you to do something terrible. It's that they won't need to, that all they'll need is your agreement. And that's where power lives, not in the threat, but in the silence you give it. A symbol comes to mind, a switch, a simple toggle between harm and mercy. It doesn't look like much, but it reveals everything. Not just about what you're capable of, but about how easily you'll lie to yourself to sleep at night. The room is quiet now. The button glows softly beneath your hand. And somewhere just outside your view, a man in a coat says, "Please continue." What do? It begins with a scream. Not yours, not directed at you, just a cry. Distant enough to ignore, but close enough that something in your chest tightens. You're walking down a city street. There are people around, office workers, students, the occasional mother with a stroller. Someone yells again, a woman pleading, panicked. You pause, look around, and then something strange happens. Everyone else keeps walking. Some glance up, most don't. And suddenly you feel frozen. Not because you don't care, but because no one else is moving. You're waiting for someone else to go first, and so are they. This is the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where the more people are present, the less likely any one of them is to help. Because each person assumes someone else will. Because action becomes diluted in the crowd. The most infamous case is the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York. Reports claimed 38 witnesses heard her screams and did nothing. The truth was more complicated. Some did try to call for help. Others misread the situation, but the core idea stuck. When responsibility is spread out, it often vanishes entirely. And you've felt it in small modern ways. A fight breaks out on the subway. Someone collapses on the sidewalk. A coworker is mistreated in a meeting. You notice, your body tenses. But your eyes scan the room and no one else is moving, so you don't either. Because when everyone hesitates, hesitation feels safe. This is where psychology meets identity. Because deep down you want to be the one who helps, the one who steps in. But in the moment your mind whispers, what if I'm overreacting? What if I'm wrong? What if I embarrass myself? And so your concern gets filtered through a defense mechanism rationalization. You tell yourself maybe someone already called for help. They probably know each other. She's probably drunk. This isn't my business. But underneath all of it is fear. Fear of standing out, of acting alone, of being the only one. In Jungian terms, this is the shadow at play, the part of us that longs to do good but also longs to remain safe. You want to be seen as moral, but you also want to disappear into the group, to act without consequence, to help without risk. And that's the paradox. You want to be brave, as long as someone else is brave first. But in most of these situations, no one ever goes first. The bystander effect isn't about cruelty, it's about inertia. When you see a crowd, your brain assumes consensus. If it were serious, someone would have done something. So you suppress your instinct, you outsource your gut, and the moment passes. The image that lingers here isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's the slow turning of heads that don't fully commit. The half step forward that turns into a shuffle away. 1,000 small invisible no's disguised as nothing. And still the scream. The experiment that captured this best was staged by psychologists Darley and Latané. College students were told they were participating in a discussion via intercom, speaking with others one-on-one. In reality, the voices were pre-recorded. Partway through one of the voices, a student begins having a seizure, pleading, gasping, falling silent. If participants believed they were the only witness, 85% rushed to help. If they thought there were 2 other people listening, that dropped to 62%. When they believed 4 others were also hearing the seizure, only 31% helped. Same situation, same voice, different assumptions. And that's the lesson. Your behavior isn't just shaped by your values, but by who you think is watching. If you think you're the only one, you act. If you think others are watching, you wait. And maybe that's what makes this so haunting. Not that people are heartless, but that kindness itself can be paused by illusion. So here's the question. What kind of world would we live in if everyone waited for someone else? Because the truth is, every crowd that failed to help was made of individuals who thought the same thing, that someone else would go first, that surely they wouldn't be the only one to care. But caring doesn't mean much if it never becomes action. This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Next time you hesitate in a subway, in a hallway, in your own family, ask yourself, am I silent because I believe it's right? Or because I'm afraid to stand alone? There's a quiet power in being the one who moves first. Not with heroics, not with ego, but with presence. Sometimes all it takes is one person to break the trance, one person to step forward, to ask, are you okay? To say this isn't right, to make the invisible visible. Because when someone does, others follow. The symbol here is simple, a still room full of watchers. And then one person moves, the room shifts. Eyes follow, energy breaks, the spell ends, and help arrives. It always starts with one. So maybe the real question is, when it happens again, will that one be you? It started as a simulation, a study, a harmless experiment meant to last 2 weeks. But after 6 days, it was shut down. Not because of data, but because of damage. psychological, invisible, yet real enough to leave scars. You know it as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, it asked a simple question: what happens when ordinary people are given power over others? The setup was minimal. A fake prison in the basement of a university. Randomly selected male college students, half assigned to be guards, half to be prisoners. There were no scripts, no instructions to be cruel, just roles. And that was enough. Within 36 hours, the first prisoner had a breakdown. Within 4 days, the guards began inventing punishments: sleep deprivation, humiliation, denial of bathroom access. By day 6, the entire simulation had spiraled into something darker than anyone expected. The masks had fused to their faces. The line between play and reality had vanished. And that's the truth no one wants to admit. You don't need to be evil to act in evil ways. You just need permission and a role. This is the machinery of de-individuation, the psychological process where identity dissolves into the group. When you put on a uniform, you stop being you. You become the role, the mask, the function. And when no one's watching closely, that mask starts to dictate behavior. It's not just guards and prisons. You've seen it in offices, in schools, in online spaces. Someone gets a title, a badge, a little power, and something shifts. They speak differently, stand taller, their empathy thins. Maybe you've felt it in yourself, a moment where you had control over a sibling, a partner, a team, and something rose in you. Not cruelty exactly, but a temptation to dominate, to make them feel small, to test your reach. Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche that contains everything you disown, not just trauma and fear, but also power. And if you haven't made peace with your shadow, it leaks out through performance. The guard wasn't told to be cruel. He simply believed that's what the role required. Because once you're in costume, your morality becomes negotiable. That's the paradox. You act out what you think a person in power would do, even if that image is twisted. And where does that image come from? From media, from memories, from the culture's archetypes of dominance. You imitate without knowing. You perform scripts you didn't write. This isn't limited to authority. It applies to any role you've taken too seriously. The good child who suppresses anger. The strong friend who never cries. The smart one who fears failure. Each role promises safety and quietly extracts authenticity. In the Stanford experiment, even the prisoners began to internalize their labels. They stopped using their names, they accepted abuse, they rebelled then relented. Not because they were weak, but because the environment made the identity feel real. That's how fast it happens. You think of yourself as consistent, but behavior is fluid. Context shapes action, uniforms shape belief, and in the wrong environment, even your softness can be silenced. It's easy to distance yourself from that basement prison, to say I would have stopped it, but Zimbardo himself didn't. As the lead researcher, he watched it unfold and didn't intervene. Until an outsider, a graduate student, walked in and said, "This isn't okay." He'd gotten too close. He'd become his role. So ask yourself, where are you playing a role that's slowly changing you? Not with malice, just with repetition. Where are you hiding behind identity, letting it do the speaking, the reacting, the choosing? Because when the costume fits too well, you forget it's there. The experiment collapsed not from violence, but from awakening. Someone broke the spell. Someone saw the room clearly, not as a study, but as a mirror. And suddenly, no one could unsee it. That's how healing begins, with awareness, with stepping back from the character, with asking, "Who am I without this mask?" The symbol here is haunting a mirror cracked down the middle. On one side, the role you perform. On the other, the face you've forgotten. And the soft question that lingers: which version of you has been in charge? And which one has been quietly waiting to return? There's a quiet assumption you carry that people see the world like you do, that your opinions are reasonable, that your reactions make sense, and if someone thinks differently, well, they're probably uninformed, irrational, or just wrong. It's subtle, not arrogance, just a gentle illusion that your mind paints over reality, a belief that your inner world is the baseline, that your way of interpreting life is the normal way, that most people, if they were honest, would agree with you. This illusion has a name: the false consensus effect. Psychologists first discovered it through a simple study. They asked people to read a scenario, like whether to report a coworker who made a mistake. Participants had to choose what they would do, then estimate how many others would make the same choice. And overwhelmingly, people believed that most others would do what they did. But they didn't. The group was always split, and yet everyone thought they were in the majority, because your brain prefers to believe that it lives in a world filled with familiar minds that echo yours, values that mirror yours, choices that validate your own. Why? Because it feels safe, reassuring, stabilizing. The alternative, that most people are walking around with completely different frameworks, emotions, biases, triggers, is too disorienting, too lonely. So your mind builds a projection, a kind of psychological camouflage, and you live inside it without noticing, until something cracks it. Maybe it's a political argument with someone you love. Maybe it's seeing a friend support something you find unthinkable. Maybe it's watching strangers cheer for something that makes your stomach twist. And suddenly, the mirror fractures. You realize you weren't seeing others. You were seeing your own reflection projected outward. This is more than a quirk. It's a form of psychological defense, a subtle mechanism of the ego trying to maintain cohesion. Because if others disagree, then maybe you're wrong. And the ego, desperate to preserve identity, will do almost anything to avoid that uncertainty. So it creates consensus where none exists. But here's the paradox: the more confident you are that others think like you, the less likely it's true. Because true awareness, true presence, means holding space for difference, for dissonance, for contradiction. It means letting go of the comfort of sameness. But most of us aren't taught how to do that. We're taught to seek echo chambers, to curate feeds, to surround ourselves with agreement. Because disagreement doesn't just challenge ideas, it challenges self-perception. And perception is fragile. Philosopher Thomas Nagel once asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" It wasn't a joke. It was a thought experiment about subjectivity. No matter how much data you collect about sonar, about physiology, you'll never feel what it's like to be a bat. Because you're not one. Your perspective is locked inside your body, your mind, and so is everyone else's. That's the haunting truth. You will never fully know what it's like to be anyone else. All you have is imagination. But imagination requires effort, humility, the willingness to admit I might not understand, and in a world that rewards certainty that feels like weakness. So we cling to false mirrors. We tell ourselves they probably agree with me. They'd do the same thing. They think like I do, but they don't. And maybe that's not a threat, but a doorway. Because when the mirror breaks, something new can begin. Not consensus, but curiosity. What would it mean to move through the world without assuming sameness? To ask questions instead of predicting answers. to let people surprise you, not as betrayals, but as revelations. The symbolic image here is quiet, a mirror fogged by breath. You wipe it, expecting your own face. But another face appears, one you didn't expect. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. And you realize the world is not a reflection, it's a mosaic. The soft question that forms, if you stopped assuming others are like you, what might you finally see? It's a famous experiment, now almost cliché, in how often it's cited. But that doesn't make it less haunting. You're asked to watch a short video. 2 teams, one in white shirts, one in black, pass a basketball back and forth. Your task is simple. Count how many times the white team passes the ball. You focus. Track the movements. Count carefully. When the video ends, the researcher asks, "Did you see the gorilla?" You blink. "What gorilla?" They rewind. And there it is, a person in a full gorilla suit, walking slowly through the center of the frame. Not hiding, not subtle. They even stop and beat their chest, but you didn't see it. Not because it was hidden, but because you weren't looking for it. This is inattentional blindness, your brain's tendency to miss what it doesn't expect. It's not a flaw, it's a survival mechanism. Your mind filters the world to protect you from overwhelm. There's simply too much to process, so it narrows your focus and in doing so, erases what doesn't fit the current task. And that's the terrifying part. You don't just miss things. You don't even notice that you missed them. You move through life believing you're seeing the whole picture. But what you're really seeing is what your mind has decided matters. The rest, no matter how obvious, disappears. Think about how this plays out beyond videos. You're in a relationship. Focused on fixing one thing, you miss the emotional withdrawal happening in plain sight. You're at work, chasing deadlines. You don't see the burnout growing in your team. You're in your own body, watching your weight. You ignore your chronic fatigue, your sleep, your anxiety. Because your focus creates blind spots, and your blind spots shape your reality. This isn't just about attention. It's about belief, about what you allow yourself to see and what you subconsciously erase. And often what you erase is what you fear. Aging parents, a drifting partner, a growing addiction, a quiet truth that if acknowledged would demand change. So your mind looks away. Not maliciously, just protectively. This is the ego's denial mechanism, not in the dramatic sense, but in the everyday way. We ignore what unsettles us, not because it isn't there, but because we're focused on something else, something easier, something measurable. And just like that, the gorilla walks through your life undetected. Jung said people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Inattentional blindness isn't just about experiments. It's about spiritual avoidance, about what we don't want to see in ourselves, in others, in the systems we benefit from. Because to see would be to change. There's a paradox here. Your focus is both your power and your prison. What you pay attention to grows. What you ignore decays. So the question becomes, what are you choosing not to see? Not because it's hidden, but because it's uncomfortable. And how would your life shift if you turned toward it? Philosopher Alan Watts once said that consciousness is like a spotlight. It lights up only what it's aimed at. But the darkness outside the beam, that's still you. That's still real. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate blind spots. That's impossible. Maybe the goal is to remember that they're there, to hold your perceptions loosely, to say this is what I see, but it might not be everything. The symbolic image here is simple surreal. A stage brightly lit in the center where you count the movements with precision. But just beyond the light, in the shadows, something watches. Not sinister, just unnoticed, waiting to be acknowledged. The soft question is one you rarely ask yourself. What truth is walking right through your life while you're busy counting something else? It's easy to believe that evil announces itself, that harm arrives with a snarl, a threat, a visible weapon. But often it doesn't. Often it shows up in a uniform, with a badge, a name tag, a calm voice, a clipboard, and you trust it because it looks like it belongs. That's the unsettling lesson of the Hoffling Hospital experiment. Conducted in 1966, the study tested real nurses in real hospitals without their knowledge. Each nurse received a phone call from a man identifying himself as Dr. Smith, someone they didn't know claiming to be a supervising physician. He instructed them to administer a dose of a drug Astroten to a patient immediately. The dose was double the maximum safe amount, printed clearly on the label. The drug wasn't listed in the hospital's approved medication list, and the protocol strictly forbade accepting verbal medication orders over the phone. Every warning sign was there, and yet 21 out of 22 nurses began preparing the injection. They were stopped before actually giving it. But that's not the point. The point is how fast authority quiets doubt. These were professionals, trained, experienced, compassionate. But one firm male voice with a title overrode years of education, instinct, and policy. Because it didn't feel dangerous, it felt official. This is what psychologists call legitimized obedience, when a figure of perceived authority overrides your internal compass. You don't feel forced, you feel responsible, helpful, dutiful. You're not breaking the rules, you're following orders. And that's the trap. Because your conscience isn't loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers, it nudges, it hesitates. And in a world that rewards speed, certainty, and compliance, hesitation feels like failure. So the voice inside you, the one that says this isn't right, gets buried under the weight of uniforms, titles, and system-sanctioned control. This is where inner child psychology merges with the social experiment. The part of you that was raised to listen to teachers, to trust adults, to obey rules without question, never truly leaves. It grows up wearing new clothes, working in hospitals, offices, cities. But it still looks for someone to tell it what to do. And when it finds that voice, it listens, even if the instructions feel wrong. Especially then, because defiance feels like disloyalty, like arrogance, like risk. So instead of questioning, you rationalize. You say, he must know more than I do. This isn't my place. It's probably fine. It's not really my decision. And just like that, you've become part of a chain. Not evil, not cruel, just compliant, passive, functioning, a cog. And here lies the paradox: your desire to help can be used to harm. Because the same instincts that make you reliable obedience, trust, respect, also make you vulnerable to manipulation. It's not just hospitals. It's corporations, religious structures, governments, family dynamics. Any system where authority is unchallenged becomes a stage for quiet harm. Not because of monsters, but because of well-meaning people doing their job. People like the nurses, people like you. So what breaks the spell? What stops the injection? Sometimes all it takes is pause. A moment to ask, does this feel right? Not is it allowed, not. Did someone approve it, but does this align with what I know deep down? That pause is a rebellion. It reclaims the body from autopilot. It reactivates conscience, not as a weapon, but as a compass. Because conscience doesn't scream, it waits. And when you stop long enough, it returns. The symbolic image here is hauntingly still: a nurse's hand holding a syringe suspended midair, a phone dangling, a fluorescent light buzzing. and in the nurse's eyes not fear but doubt, a flicker, a second thought, a voice rising from within that says no. That flicker is everything, because it means the spell can be broken. And the soft question becomes, when the voice of authority contradicts the voice inside you, which one do you answer? You walk into a room, brightly lit, a long table, strangers sit beside you. A researcher enters and explains, "You're part of a vision study." You nod, seems simple. They hold up a card with 3 lines A, B, and C and ask which line matches the reference. Easy, you say C. Everyone else says B. You pause. Are they joking? The next card. You say A. They all say C. Again and again, the same pattern. Your answers feel obvious, but the group disagrees. Consistently, confidently. You laugh nervously, glance around, start second-guessing, and eventually, you say what they say, even though it's wrong. That's the Ash conformity experiment, a simple but profound study, revealing just how much your sense of truth depends on the people around you. Over 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving clearly incorrect answers just to align with the group. Why? Not because they believed the answers were right, but because disagreement feels dangerous. Your brain is wired for connection, for survival in groups. In ancient times, rejection from the tribe meant death, so your body even now reacts viscerally to being the outlier. Heart rate spikes, palms sweat. Your nervous system floods with cortisol, all because you said the wrong letter. This is more than peer pressure. It's a collision between perception and identity, between what your eyes see and what the group says is real. And in that collision, something crumbles. Because the brain, when confronted with social friction, often bends reality to preserve belonging. That's the paradox. You'd rather be wrong with the group than right alone. And it shows up everywhere. In classrooms where no one raises their hand. In meetings where silence means agreement. In families where no one names the secret everyone feels. You become the stranger in the mirror, watching yourself nod, smile, conform, knowing it's not quite you, but not knowing how to stop. This isn't weakness, it's biology and psychology and fear. The fear of being the only one. The ego defense here is subtle compliance masquerading as harmony. You don't want conflict, you want peace. You want to believe that going along is kindness, that silence is maturity, that saying nothing is neutrality. But often, it's surrender, not to truth, but to comfort, to the relief of being accepted, even when it costs your authenticity. Carl Jung warned of this. He wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. And part of that burden is the inherited silence, the unspoken rule that says, don't rock the boat. That says be agreeable. That says fit in no matter what. But who are you fitting into? What shape are you molding yourself around? And how long can you hold that pose before it becomes your default?" There's a symbolic image here, a person standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection is slightly delayed, slightly off, not quite matching. The smile is forced, the eyes tired, a subtle crack forming between how you look and how you feel. Because deep down you know, when you've betrayed your own clarity, you feel it in the tightness of your chest, in the overthinking after the conversation ends, in the subtle ache of not being known, not because others rejected you, but because you never showed them the real version to begin with. So what now? Not defiance, not rebellion for its own sake, just presence, just a quiet question when you find yourself in the crowd. Is what I'm about to say true or just accepted? Is this answer mine or borrowed? Because sometimes your voice will shake when you speak your truth. Sometimes the room will go quiet. Sometimes people will look at you strangely. But sometimes someone else was waiting for permission to stop conforming too. And they were just waiting for you to go first. The soft question that lingers. If you could be seen exactly as you are, would you still choose to blend in? It begins so innocently. A crowd gathers. The sun is setting. Music pulses. The air is thick with movement, laughter, shadows. You lose sight of where you begin and others end. Something stirs in you, a loosening, a boldness, a permission. You feel bolder, louder, less responsible. You're still you, but something's shifted. This is de-individuation, the psychological phenomenon, where personal identity dissolves in the presence of a group, especially when anonymity is added. You become part of the collective, and with that absorption comes an eerie liberation. From guilt, from inhibition, from self-awareness. Masks help, uniforms help, darkness helps. All things that blur you into the many. The classic experiment, Zimbardo's hooded shock study. Participants were asked to deliver electric shocks to others. Half wore name tags and regular clothes. The others wore identical robes and hoods, their faces hidden. The hooded group delivered shocks twice as intensely. Same people, same setup, but anonymity became a key. Because when you can't be identified, you don't feel responsible. When your face is hidden, your shadow is more free to roam. And the paradox is unsettling. The more you disappear into the group, the more parts of yourself emerge that you didn't know were there. It's not always violent, sometimes it's just strange. At concerts, in riots, on anonymous forums, in online arguments where usernames replace faces, people say things, do things they'd never consider alone. Because the group dilutes consequences, and once consequence fades, so does conscience. But this isn't just about crowds. It happens in uniforms, in jobs, in systems. Anytime your role becomes bigger than your name. You're not John. You're security, not Sarah. You're manager, not human, just function. And when function takes over, empathy flickers. It's not intentional. It's protective. The ego finds comfort in roles. Roles carry expectations. Expectations free you from uncertainty. You don't have to choose. The mask chooses for you. And after a while, you forget it's a mask. This is the tragedy of the performed self. Jung might call this a fragmented persona, a social identity built not on wholeness, but on adaptation. You become what's required. And slowly you forget what's real. Maybe you were the shy kid who learned to be funny, the angry teen who became the peacemaker, the sensitive child who became the boss. And now, decades later, those masks still cling to you, not because they fit, but because they worked. But working and belonging aren't the same. Wearing a mask that gets applause isn't the same as being seen, and yet you fear taking it off. Because what if there's nothing underneath? Or worse, what if what's underneath isn't enough? So you stay inside the crowd, inside the role, inside the performance, and your soul waits. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "The greatest danger, that of losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all." That's what de-individuation does, not in an explosion, but in a hush. A soft forgetting. You stop hearing your inner voice. You echo others. You stop asking what you think and start repeating what's expected. And eventually, the real you becomes the stranger. So what breaks the spell? Recognition. A moment of self-awareness. A mirror held up in the middle of the crowd. It might come from a child who asks, "Why did you yell?" from a friend who says, "That didn't sound like you." From a silence that feels too heavy to ignore. Or maybe it comes from within. A pause, a breath, a realization. I don't want to be this version anymore. That's the beginning, not dramatic, just honest. The symbolic image, a masquerade ball. Everyone in ornate masks, music swirling. You remove yours slowly. The room blurs, some glance, most don't notice. But your face for the first time feels real. And the air feels lighter. The soft question that follows. Who are you when no one's watching, and would you recognize that face if it looked back at you? It never begins with the big ask. No one walks up and demands your integrity. No voice says, betray yourself now. It starts smaller, softer, almost invisible. Can you stay late just this once? Could you leave that part out of the report? It's not technically wrong, just a gray area. You nod. It's not a big deal. It's easier to go along. You tell yourself it's temporary, that you're still in control. But then it happens again and again. This is the foot in the door technique, a psychological strategy where compliance with a small request increases the likelihood of compliance with larger ones later. Once you say yes to something minor, you're more likely to say yes to something major, simply to remain consistent with your previous behavior. Because your brain wants harmony, it wants to believe you are logical, steady, principled. So once you step forward even slightly, your mind begins adjusting the story to fit your action. It says, this must be okay because I already said yes. And slowly the line shifts. That's the paradox. Every big compromise begins with a small permission. You didn't betray yourself in one bold act. You did it in increments, and it's not just in behavior, it's internal too. A person who once had boundaries starts softening them, not out of weakness, but out of hope. Hope that things will improve, that people will notice, that it won't keep happening. But it does. Because patterns reward themselves, and the longer you stay in the loop, the more you forget where the original line even was. This is cognitive dissonance, the discomfort between your values and your actions. But instead of changing your actions, you slowly rewrite your values to reduce the friction. You tell yourself, it's not that bad. Everyone does this. I can fix it later. And those thoughts, while comforting, become the mask you wear to bed. The one you stare at in the mirror and wonder why it doesn't quite fit. Gabor Mate writes about this in the context of trauma, how we abandon parts of ourselves not out of malice but out of necessity. The child who learns to appease to stay safe. The teen who silences their voice to belong. The adult who says yes when their body screams no, just to avoid conflict. And each yes becomes a brick in the wall that separates you from your core. Until one day you wake up and realize you've crossed a line you didn't even know you were near. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. That's the most haunting part. There's no one moment to point to, just a series of tiny yeses that led you somewhere you never intended to go. And now you look back and wonder, how did I get here? But that question, as painful as it is the beginning of return. Because once you see the pattern, you can interrupt it with a pause, with a breath, with a no. Even a small one. The same way you entered the spiral is the way you leave it, one step at a time. The symbolic image here is soft but weighted, a long hallway with faint lines on the floor. One step past, then another. At first you don't notice, then the air changes. You look back. The entrance is barely visible now. And ahead, a door you never meant to walk toward. The soft question that hovers. What have you been saying yes to not? Because it feels right, but because it's easier than turning around. The room is quiet, staged like a play. A child enters, a doll sits on a table. Across the room, an adult walks in, unaware of the child's gaze. The adult grows frustrated, hits the doll, kicks it, screams at it, then leaves. Now the child is alone with the doll, and what do? They imitate. They punch, kick, yell, even when no one tells them to, even when no one's watching. This is the Bobo doll experiment, one of psychology's most revealing glimpses into observational learning. Conducted by Albert Bandura in the 1960s, it shattered the illusion that children only learn through instruction. They learn by watching, absorbing, echoing, and not just behavior, but emotion, tone, response. And they don't need to be told what's acceptable, they feel it. They read the room, they watch the way anger is handled, how sadness is silenced, how power is used. And in their silence, they inherit it all. Now zoom out. You're no longer the child in the room. You're the adult, and someone somewhere is watching you, even when you forget. A niece, a student, a stranger. A version of you that still lingers in your own memory, watching how you treat yourself, how you respond to pressure, how you soften or snap. You may not realize it, but you're modeling behavior all the time. When you smile to hide discomfort, when you apologize for existing, when you dismiss your own needs, or when you speak truth gently, when you breathe instead of break, all of it becomes a template. And here lies the paradox: you teach most loudly, not through what you say, but through what you tolerate. Children, and even the child inside you, don't learn through instruction manuals. They learn through energy, through repetition, through how you move through rooms, how you handle silence, how you love or abandon yourself. And this modeling isn't just outward. You model behavior internally too. The way your inner voice speaks to your failures becomes the voice your inner child hears every day. Is it gentle? Is it cruel? Is it absent? What does that younger part of you witness when you fall short? Because we all fall short. But it's how we respond that writes the script for what's acceptable in ourselves, in others, in future generations. Bandura's experiment wasn't just about aggression. It was about permission. The adult who hit the doll gave the child permission to do the same, without even speaking. So ask yourself, what do I give others permission to repeat just by being who I am unexamined? It's not about blame, it's about responsibility. You're not perfect, you won't be. That's not the point. The point is awareness, to notice when your exhaustion spills into harshness, when your unhealed anger becomes sharpness, when your self-neglect teaches that needs don't matter. And just as importantly, when your boundaries model safety, when your softness models strength, when your stillness models presence. You can't control how others interpret you, but you can become more conscious of what you embody. And in doing so, you begin to reparent the younger versions of you who never got to see that model, who were told silently, constantly, that love had to be earned, that emotion was a threat, that needs were too loud. The symbolic image here is simple. Tender a child, behind a glass window, watching a grown-up tie their own shoe. It's not the action that matters, it's the energy, the presence, the slowness, the reminder that even mundane moments are blueprints. The soft question that follows: if someone is watching you right now and learning how to treat themselves, what are they learning? You're in a meeting, or a family dinner, or a classroom. A decision is being made, one that doesn't sit right with you. Something about it feels off, incomplete, but everyone else seems aligned, nodding, agreeing, smiling like it all makes sense. You pause, look around, wait for someone to speak up. No one does. So you stay silent too, not because you've changed your mind, but because the room feels heavier than your voice. This is groupthink, the quiet force that pulls individuals toward consensus, even when it contradicts their inner knowing. It's not forced, No one tells you to agree, but the air becomes so thick with unspoken expectation that disagreement feels like betrayal. The original studies on groupthink came from Irving Janis in the 1970s. He analyzed catastrophic decisions like the Bay of Pigs invasion and found the same patterns: high group cohesion, isolation, from dissenting views, a desire for harmony over truth. And the haunting result: nobody challenged the plan, even when doubts existed, even when lives were at stake. Because sometimes keeping the peace becomes more important than being right. And here lies the paradox: the more tightly a group bonds, the more truth becomes a threat. Because truth introduces friction, and friction, even in service of wisdom, threatens the illusion of unity. You've felt it in conversations where your question dies in your throat, in friendships where honesty starts to feel rude, in families where history is edited for comfort. The ego defense here is avoidance. You want to belong. You don't want to be the difficult one. So you trade clarity for connection, or at least the appearance of it. But over time, those trades add up. You stop asking, you stop doubting, you stop seeing, and slowly you begin to adopt the group's beliefs, not out of conviction, but out of repetition. Because when enough people believe something, it starts to feel real. This isn't just social, it's neurological. Your brain is designed to mirror, to synchronize, to pick up on the dominant energy in the room. That's how cultures form, how traditions survive, how rituals get passed down. But it's also how distortions become normal, how cruelty gets wrapped in patriotism, how silence becomes the family's love language, how injustice wears the face of the way things are. And it all feels so seamless until someone leaves the group. And from the outside, they look back and wonder, how did we all believe that? Not because they're better, but because distance grants vision. Sometimes the clearest thought you'll have is the one you can't say out loud. And yet, truth has a pulse. It returns. In sleeplessness, in discomfort, in quiet shame, in the realization that peace without honesty is just a more elegant prison. Carl Jung believed that truth repressed becomes shadow, not just in individuals, but in collectives. A culture that punishes dissent breeds a collective unconscious, full of projection paranoia and quiet rage. So the question becomes, are you agreeing, or are you just afraid of being alone with your thoughts? Because agreement isn't always alignment, and silence isn't always peace, and consensus isn't always truth. Sometimes one honest voice fractures the illusion. And yes, it may be met with resistance, but it may also unlock something others have been afraid to name. Because someone always sees it too. They just didn't know they were allowed to speak. The symbolic image here is surreal and soft. A table of people, their mouths stitched shut with thread, all nodding in unison, except for one who looks up, not in anger, but in gentle confusion. A hand on the thread ready to pull. The soft question lingers. If truth costs you belonging, which one do you choose to lose? Imagine this: you're placed in a room. No phone, no books, no distractions. Just a chair, a table, and a single red button. You're told the button delivers an electric shock, not dangerous but definitely painful. Then the researcher leaves. You're alone. For 15 minutes. And within that time, most people press the button, not because they're curious, not because they enjoy pain, but because doing nothing is worse. This was the finding of a 2014 study by Timothy Wilson and colleagues. Participants were left alone with their thoughts, and many found the stillness so intolerable that they chose discomfort over silence. One man shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. The conclusion: we'd rather experience pain than be alone with ourselves. That's the paradox. Stillness can feel more threatening than suffering. Because in stillness, your mind has nowhere to hide. It starts to wander into doubt, into memory, into unresolved shame. You start to feel your breath, your restlessness, the weight of your own company. And suddenly a shock feels like relief. Not because it's good, but because it's something, and something feels safer than nothing. This is the psychology of self-sabotage, not as punishment, but as escape. From boredom, from anxiety, from the unbearable intimacy of your own mind. You see it in everyday life, checking your phone the moment silence stretches too long. Picking a fight just to break the numbness, returning to habits you hate, because at least they're familiar. Because discomfort you choose feels better than vulnerability you can't control. The ego defense here is distraction. Your mind learns to avoid its own depths by manufacturing noise. And if no noise exists, it creates one, even if it hurts. Jung wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And here it is, the absurdity of pain, chosen over presence. But it makes sense. From childhood, most of us weren't taught to sit with feeling. We were taught to fix it, to numb it, to move on. So when emotion arises in stillness, grief, fear, shame, your nervous system panics. It says, do something, anything, even if that means pressing the button. The symbolic image is simple, almost cinematic. A quiet room with a red button, glowing softly. A person stares at it, their fingers twitching. The air is still. Outside the window, the world turns. Inside, a storm brews, not of noise but of absence. Because silence isn't empty, it's full of everything you haven't processed, and your body knows, so it rebels. But what if you didn't press the button? What if instead you sat longer? What if the wave of discomfort didn't mean something's wrong, but something's ready to be seen? Because beneath boredom is often grief. Beneath restlessness is often hunger, not for stimulation, but for connection. Beneath the urge to shock is often the urge to feel, not pain, but realness, aliveness. And the soft question becomes, what are you trying not to feel? When the silence finally arrives, you get a resume on your desk. Same experience, same education, same credentials. One name is Emily, the other Lakeisha. One gets a callback, the other doesn't. You see two photos. One face is lighter-skinned, smiling subtly. The other is darker, equally composed. You feel something shift in you. You might not notice it, but your decision's already been shaped. You don't think of yourself as biased. You don't want to be. You believe in fairness, but the science says otherwise. Study after study reveals the truth. Your brain judges faster than your awareness can catch. This is implicit bias, unconscious attitudes that affect the way you think, feel, and act toward others. Even when you consciously reject stereotypes, your internalized patterns often operate beneath the surface. You might smile, speak kindly, hold progressive values, and still make decisions that favor the familiar, not because you're cruel, but because your mind was trained quietly, subtly from birth to trust certain shapes, sounds, colors, mannerisms. It's not just about race. It's about gender, age, accent, clothing, body size, posture. A man interrupts in a meeting and you interpret it as confidence. A woman does the same and it feels aggressive. A young person hesitates and you assume they're lost. An older person speaks and you stop listening. None of this is deliberate, but it is real. The paradox is this: you can believe in equality and still act in ways that reinforce inequality, because belief lives in the conscious mind, but action is shaped by layers deeper, cultural, historical, inherited. Even your memory plays along. In one study, participants were shown images of a white man holding a gun and a black man holding a wallet. Later, they remembered it in reverse, not because they lied, but because the mind edited the truth to fit expectation. This is the ego defense of projection, assigning your fear, doubt, or discomfort onto the other. And it happens fastest when the brain is trying to shortcut understanding, when it fills in blanks with assumptions instead of questions. And perhaps the most dangerous part, your mind often tells you nothing's happened at all. That's how bias survives, not in obvious acts of hatred, but in ordinary moments of preference, of who gets heard, who gets invited, who gets the benefit of the doubt. It lives in micro-decisions, hiring, dating, disciplining, trusting, all made in fractions of seconds, justified after the fact. And here's the discomfort. Even if you mean well, your impact still ripples. Even if you try your best, your patterns still leak through. And this isn't about shame. It's about ownership. You're not responsible for the culture that programmed you, but you are responsible for the programming you continue. So what can you do? You slow down. You notice. You interrupt the automatic. You ask, what assumption did I just make? Why? Not to punish yourself, but to wake up, to rewire. Bias isn't erased through guilt. It's undone through attention, over and over, until your instincts begin to reflect your intentions. The symbolic image here is stark simple. Two faces blurred together, overlapping at the edges. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And behind them, a mirror. But the reflection shows a third face, your own watching, silently choosing what to see. The soft question that lingers. Who have you already decided they are before they've said a single word? You join a study. It sounds harmless. Rate how interesting a boring task is. You're asked to perform a repetitive, tedious chore, placing pegs on a board, turning them one by one for an hour. Monotony without meaning. Then the twist. You're asked to lie. The researcher tells you we're short on staff. Can you tell the next participant the task was fun? We'll give you $1 or 20. You agree. Later you're asked, so how enjoyable was the task really? Those who were paid $20, they admit it was boring. But the ones paid only $1, they insist it was actually kind of interesting. Why? Because $1 wasn't enough of a reward to justify the lie. So instead, they changed their memory. They convinced themselves it wasn't a lie at all. This is cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when your actions conflict with your beliefs. And to reduce the discomfort, you shift one of them. In this case, you lie, but you think you're honest, so you change the story. And over time, that becomes the truth. That's the paradox. The more you try to avoid inner conflict, the more you distort reality to feel whole. It's not just about experiments. It happens in breakups. You tell yourself they were never right for you. Not because it's true, but because the pain would be too great if they were. It happens in careers. You convince yourself you love your job not because you do, but because the sacrifice of leaving feels unbearable. It happens in families. You rewrite your childhood because admitting the truth would fracture the identity you've spent decades protecting. You don't just lie to others, you lie to yourself. And the longer the lie lives, the more you believe it. Not out of weakness, out of survival. The ego's deepest function is to protect coherence. It doesn't care if the story is accurate. It cares if it holds together, if it lets you sleep at night, if it lets you face the mirror without shattering. And so the narrative bends, memory reshapes, details blur, new meaning emerges. And somewhere along the way, you forget the original truth. Not because it disappeared, but because the discomfort of holding two opposing realities, I did this, and I'm a good person, became too heavy. So you rewrite the script, and that works, for a while, until something triggers the old truth, a smell, a phrase, a forgotten photo, and suddenly the original memory pulses again. But it doesn't fit anymore. Now it feels like betrayal, because now truth threatens the entire house of cards. Carl Jung warned of this. He said people will do anything to avoid facing their own soul, even at the cost of truth, love, or sanity. And maybe that's what hurts the most. Not the lie, but how long you carried it, how many rooms it kept you from entering, how many apologies it silenced, how many parts of you it forced into exile. But the lie had a purpose. It helped you stay intact. And now maybe it's safe enough to let it go. Not to punish yourself, but to come home. To the version of you that never needed a lie to feel worthy. The symbolic image is soft, painful. A handwritten letter, folded many times, edges worn. Inside one sentence crossed out and rewritten. Over and over. The ink is smudged, but the original truth still shines faintly beneath the revisions. And the soft question is this: what belief do you cling to, not because it's true, but because you're afraid of who you'd be without it? You're in a room, 2 chairs, 2 players. Each of you has a choice: cooperate or betray. If both cooperate, you both win modestly. If one betrays and the other cooperates, the betrayer wins big. The cooperator gets nothing. If you both betray, you both lose. The catch: you make your decision alone, and you never know what the other will choose. This is the prisoner's dilemma, a classic game theory experiment that mirrors real-life choices about trust, risk, and fear. On paper, cooperation is the most logical long-term strategy. But time and time again, participants betray. Not because they're greedy, but because they're afraid. Afraid of being the one who trusted and got burned. That's the paradox you want to believe in others. But fear punishes belief faster than betrayal ever could. And so you choose safety. You protect yourself. You withhold honesty. You preempt pain. You win the short game but lose the long one. Because in protecting yourself from betrayal, you also block intimacy, and you never really know what could have been. This shows up everywhere. You keep quiet in a relationship, assuming they won't understand. You say no before they can reject you. You hide what matters most just to avoid the ache of being met with less. But the ache comes anyway, not from rejection, from not trying. And what you lose isn't a prize, it's connection, possibility, depth. This is the ego's protective impulse, a belief that if you shrink first, you'll never be made small by someone else. But in doing so, you live in a loop of half-truths. You give half-trust, receive half-love, feel half-known, and call it being smart. But smart isn't always wise. The wise part of you knows to be loved fully, you have to be seen fully, and that can't happen behind armor. The prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment, but life runs on its logic. Every day you sit across from someone, a friend, a partner, a stranger, and make micro decisions. Do I show up or stay safe? Do I extend trust or guard it? And most of the time, you hedge. Not because you're cold, but because you've been taught that vulnerability is a gamble. But what if it's not? What if it's the only honest move? Because betrayal may hurt, but self-betrayal, the kind where you don't give others the chance to meet you, that lingers longer, that becomes loneliness. Not the kind where no one's around, the kind where everyone is, but no one knows who you are. The symbolic image is dimly lit, 2 figures at a table, backs to each other, cards in hand, faces unreadable. But beneath the table, their fingers reach out, almost touching. neither sees it, but both are trying. The soft question is this: if you stopped playing to protect yourself, what kind of connection might you finally be capable of? Maybe you thought this would be about others, about what people do in strange experiments, about how easily they conform, obey, retreat into roles hurt, lie, avoid. But somewhere along the way, it became about you, about the button you might press, the silence you might keep, the face you might judge, the truth you might bend, the role you might play so well you forget you're acting. These experiments weren't just studies, they were mirrors, held up not to shame us but to remind us we are soft creatures, shaped by fear, pulled by belonging, bent by pressure, capable of cruelty and also of change. Because once you see the pattern, you are no longer just the participant. You are the observer, and observers hold power. To pause before pressing the button, to speak when the room is quiet, to trust even when fear tightens its grip, to notice your own mind and gently question it. You are not here to be perfect or pure or right. You are here to become conscious, and maybe that's enough. To live awake, to walk slowly through the machinery of your own mind, to forgive yourself for what you didn't see, and begin seeing now. No more experiments tonight, only rest. You've wandered far into the structure of human behavior. You've turned the lens inward, and you've come back with something rare: compassion, laced with clarity. So rest now. You've earned your stillness. End of script. Drift gently, and I'll meet you in the next thought.